Hello, my name is William Wechsler, and I lead the Atlantic Council's work on the Middle East and North Africa. And welcome to this event here for those here in person and for those watching on screen. This should be a very interesting discussion about an issue that has always been critically important, but is particularly timely at the moment, which is the ongoing protests and crackdowns that we have seen right now on all of our TV screens every day leading the news in Iran. But frankly, it's also been going on for quite some time in Iran, and it hasn't been getting that kind of news and attention that we've seen in the wake of the absolutely tragic and senseless killing of Mahsa Amini. And the subsequent protests, which to date have killed, and the reaction to those protests, which to date have killed at least 50 people, and probably the true number is much higher. You know, when we first started planning this event, the objective was to call attention to a dynamic that was happening inside Iran that wasn't getting as much attention. And now, of course, the world is watching, as they say. And it's reminding us that the Iranian regime that threatens a number of its neighbors in the region, threatens the rest of the world with the potential for its nuclear program. The first people that it threatens and the first victims are, of course, the people in Iran itself, who have lived under a situation where their human rights have been threatened in so many different ways for now well over 40 years. So to talk about these issues, we have a wonderful panel of experts here that is going to be ably moderated by Holly Darges in our program here at the Atlantic Council. But I'll let her introduce all of the panelists a little bit later. What I want to do is introduce our keynote speaker to kick off our discussion, Jen Gavito from the State Department. We're very, very happy to have her with us here today. She is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iraq, Iran, and Public Diplomacy in the Bureau of Near East Affairs. She has a tremendous career really dedicated on this region of the world at the State Department. She has been Minister Counselor for Political Affairs in London. She was U.S. Consul General in Munich. She was the Chief of Political Section in Jerusalem. She's been the Senior Policy Advisor to the J5 and AFRICOM. That kind of breadth of experience and depth of knowledge in the region is something that our Foreign Service produces so regularly that we take it for granted. But we don't take it for granted here at the Atlantic Council, and we're very honored to have Secretary Gavito here with us. So, Madam Secretary, let me introduce you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, and I just want to start with a huge thanks to the Atlantic Council and to human rights activists in Iran for inviting me to participate today. With these distinguished panelists, this promises to be a compelling discussion regarding Iranian human rights issues and recent developments that we've all been following so closely. The need for these types of discussions is sadly not new. The government of Iran has denied Iranians their human rights, including through severe restrictions on the rights to peaceful assembly, freedom of association, freedom of religion or belief, and freedom of expression. For decades, political dissent has been met with violent repression from the Iranian regime. We're seeing this violence again as the Iranian people have taken to the streets across the country to condemn the brutal and tragic death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini. Iranian authorities are also intent on preventing the world from watching as they violently suppress these peaceful protesters. The Iranian state has blocked internet access in much of the country and has also blocked Instagram and WhatsApp nationwide. Tragically, Amini's death, resulting from her detention by the Iranian morality police for allegedly wearing a hijab improperly, is just one especially horrifying example of the Iranian government's recent trend on cracking down on women exercising their fundamental freedoms. Her death is an affront to human rights and to the dignity of the women whom the regime's morality police claim to protect. But unfortunately, she is not alone. This summer, we noted an increase in reports of arrests of women defying the new chastity and hijab laws. I applaud these brave women, each one of them potentially risking a fate like Mahsa Amini's, to fight for their freedom to exercise their fundamental rights. The protests that we are seeing throughout Iran, in spite of the government's retaliation and attempts to obfuscate reality, show very clearly that the Iranian people and the Islamic Republic of Iran do not see eye to eye. The United States strongly supports the human rights of all Iranian women, including their right to peacefully assemble and to express themselves without fear of violence. Last week, President Biden underscored our commitment to the brave women of Iran as they demonstrated to secure their human rights. Accordingly, last Thursday, the US government announced it was imposing sanctions on Iran's morality police and senior security officials who have engaged in human rights abuses, including the suppression and killing of nonviolent protesters, as well as those abuses that resulted in Mahsa Amini's death. Through new sanctions, which also include officials of Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security, the Iranian Army's ground forces, Iran's Basij resistance forces, and Iran's law enforcement forces, we are taking action to promote accountability for and call attention to the abuses they have perpetrated. Of course, Iran's human rights abuses are not limited to suppression of women's rights and the freedom to peacefully protest. Iran continues to hold a large number of political prisoners, 632, according to the Iran Prison Atlas. This includes peaceful activists and advocates like Narges Mohammadi, whose case and many others the Department of State continues to spotlight. As President Biden said in July, the ability to speak openly and exchange ideas freely is what unlocks innovation. Accountable institutions that are free from corruption, that act transparently, and respect the rule of law are the best way to deliver growth, respond to people's needs, and ensure justice. Another disturbing development reported this summer in Iran was an increase in the scope and severity of harassment of the Baha'i community as authorities raided and demolished Baha'i homes, bulldozed villages, destroyed cemeteries, and arrested those who resisted. This surge of repression piles further hardship on a community that has long suffered from persecution at the hands of the Iranian regime, being denied access to higher education, the ability to freely conduct business, and the freedom to worship openly as they choose. Of course, the Baha'i community is not alone among the religious minorities in its persecution by the Iranian government. Christian converts, Sunni Muslims, Sufi adherents, and Yarsanis have all been targeted for their beliefs. And anti-Semitism remains alive and well among the leadership of Iran. Just this month, President Raisi continued the regime's long history of repugnant Holocaust denial in an interview. The United States will continue to call out the Iranian regime's abuses as long as the regime continues to speak and act in ways which inhibit the exercise of religious freedom. As Secretary Blinken said earlier this year, freedom of religion or belief is a human right. We know the world is safer and more stable when people have the chance to practice their faith freely and to contribute their fullest selves to their community success. President Biden and Secretary Blinken have repeatedly stressed the centrality of human rights to US foreign policy, and the United States government will continue to call out Iran's human rights abuses. We will continue to advocate for better human rights practices in Iran and urge like-minded countries to join our call. We will continue to enforce sanctions on Iranian entities perpetrating these human rights abuses, such as those imposed last week on Iran's morality police and senior officials following Mahsa Amini's death. The United States is also committed to supporting the people of Iran to freely access fact-based information online and communicate via the internet. On Friday, the Department of the Treasury issued General License D2, an update that enables information technology firms to provide more digital services to people in Iran, from access to cloud computing services to better tools to enhance their online security and privacy. Friday's action gives the Iranian people more options for secure, outside platforms and services to counter the Iranian government's efforts to surveil and censor them. We will continue to look beyond sanctions and consider all appropriate tools to promote accountability for individuals and organizations responsible for human rights abuses, including, of course, working with our allies to hold Iran accountable for these violations. And finally, we will continue to work with our friends in the NGO community to ensure that we are listening to your perspectives and learning from your experience. We thank you for your continued attention to these issues and your willingness to share the stories of those in and outside of Iran who are suffering at the hands of the Iranian authorities. Your work is invaluable to us as we proceed in our efforts, but most importantly, your work is invaluable to the Iranian people. And with that, Holly, happy to turn the floor over to you and the panel and appreciate the opportunity to be part of this today.
Thank you, Deputy Assistant Secretary Gavito. Hello, everyone. I'm Holly Darges, and I am a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs. I'm going to dive right in. Mahsa Jina Amini, the name heard around the world. The so-called morality police murdered the 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman after being detained at a Tehran metro station for quote-unquote violating mandatory hijab. Since her death on September 16th, protesters have taken to the street in over 93 cities and provincial towns in 30 out of 31 of Iran's provinces. According to state media, security forces have killed at least 41 and arrested hundreds. Human rights organizations believe those numbers to be much higher, and I believe that to be true. Extraordinary images have captured the world of this youth-led movement with women at the forefront, who are removing their headscarves, burning their headscarves, and even cutting their hair. Protesters chant, "Death to Khamenei," "I will fight, I will die, I will take back Iran," and "This year is bloody, Sayyid Ali Khamenei will be overthrown," vocalizing that they are done with the status quo and no longer want an Islamic republic. As protests continue, the internet has undergone an almost total shutdown with the blocking of messaging app WhatsApp and photo sharing app Instagram, popular ways for Iranians to communicate and share what's happening in their country with the outside world. During the November 2019 protests, in which security forces arrested and killed thousands, a week-long internet shutdown gave security forces the cover to commit atrocious human rights violations across Iran. Since the protests began 11 days ago, security forces have also arrested prominent activists, including Hossein Ronaghi and Majid Tawakkoli, and at least 20 journalists. But before Mahsa Jina Amini's death, there was already a rise in repression in recent months. In June, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei called for a crackdown similar to the year 1981, a horrific nod to a time of unparalleled brutality with mass executions and arrests. At the same time, human rights organizations noted a resumption of public executions, the first in over 2 years, and also a jump in executions overall in a country that, for years, was the leading executioner in the world per capita. Despite international pressure, in 2021, the rate of executions increased 26% from the previous year. Additionally, there's been an uptick in the egregious persecution of religious minorities, namely the apolitical Baha'i faith, which is not recognized by the Islamic Republic. In July alone, authorities arrested 52 members of the Baha'i faith, closed businesses, raided dozens of homes, and even demolished them. There's also been extreme pressure against women's rights activists, and recently, a crackdown on women for quote-unquote violating mandatory hijab. In August, a decree was signed by President Ebrahim Raisi, who already had blood on his hands for the killing of thousands of political prisoners in Iran's jails in 1988. The decree further restricted how women could dress, essentially signing Amini's death certificate. For over a year, there's been an unprecedented tightening of the internet. In July 2021, the hardline majority parliament moved closer to implementing a bill that would curb online freedom, known as the so-called Cyberspace Protection Bill. Even the Supreme Leader referenced it in his June speech, in which he called for the bill to be ratified. But as Iranian internet users will tell you, the bill, which increases online censorship and limits internet access, is secretly being implemented without being passed. Today, we have a heavy topic and a lot to cover. I'm delighted to introduce Mahsa Ali Mardani, Yegane Rezaian, Skylar Thompson, and Anthony Vance. Mahsa is a senior researcher on the Middle East and North Africa, specializing in technology and human rights with the rights organization Article 19. Yegane is an Iranian journalist and senior researcher on the Middle East at the Committee to Protect Journalists. In 2014, while living in Iran as a journalist, she and her husband, the then Washington Post Terror Bureau Chief Jason Rezaian, were detained by authorities. Rezaian was jailed for 72 days and then fought for her husband's freedom, which was not granted until January 2016. Skylar is the senior advocacy coordinator at Human Rights Activists in Iran, also known as HRANA, which is a leading human rights organization dedicated to the monitoring and documentation of the situation of human rights in Iran. We're honored to have HRANA co-host this event with us. Anthony is the director of the U.S. Baha'i Office of Public Affairs. Since the office was created in the 1980s, Iran has been the dominant country of concern in this area. With everything that's happening in Iran now, I think it's best to first discuss the ongoing protests. Yegi, one of the things I think we should talk about is, I guess to put it simply, it's really hard to find an Iranian woman that hasn't encountered the morality police. You've had your own incident with them, and were actually taken to the same detention center where Mahsa Amini was held in Iran. So what happens when women are detained for quote-unquote violating hijab, and why are we seeing a crackdown on women in recent months?
Thank you, Holly, and the Atlantic Council for having us today, and to my co-panelists. Talking about experience, as you said, growing up in Iran, it's impossible to know someone a young woman who has not been arrested because of allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. And again, talking about experience, I was arrested multiple times by this morality police, especially during the Ahmadinejad years, since he stepped up the morality police power and gave them more severe orders and power to just do whatever they want, and there was no one to be able to question their power. I was taken actually multiple times to the same police station, or the morality police station called Wechsler, where Mahsa Amini ended up, and unfortunately was treated brutally and faced death and that horrible fate. This is not a center that, as members of the regime claim, is designed to give you some educational lessons and make you sign a piece of paper that you swear you are gonna, from now on, always stick to your hijab and then let you go. This is a place that from the moment you sit in that police van to be taken to, you are bad-mouthed. You are treated either verbally or physically very violently, and when they take you there, everyone knows the name Wechsler. It's a brutal place, and there is no one who can oversee whatever that happens there. So the morality police has the highest power over anyone who is that center. So I assume those videos released showing lots of cut and paste in those videos showing allegedly that person is Mahsa, if she is, walking through those halls. They never released the videos behind the scenes, so we don't know what has happened to her. And why did the Islamic Republic stepped up their brutal measures about young women? These are young women who were born after the revolution. These are much stronger and braver than people of my generation. I remember in 2009, when we were in the street, we would chant our slogans, we would say whatever we want, but if we saw security forces coming, most of us would leave. This is the next generation. They are fed up with whatever that has happened to the country for the past 45 years, but they are also hungry for being connected to the rest of the world, to be heard, to have their most basic rights, just because they were born in the system that is called Islamic Republic and is trying to force them the so-called Islamic laws doesn't mean that they adhere to it or they believe in it. Behind closed doors, these younger generations make their own decisions and do not necessarily believe in whatever government is trying to dictate or brainwash them with. I saw, I'm sure you saw, Holly, those videos in the past few days. Not only they stand and confront the security forces, but they're ready to fight and defend. I'm not saying fight in the sense that the protesters are violent. They are not. I have watched videos of them being very, very peaceful. But if they are treated with violence, they are ready to stand and confront that violence and defend themselves. And I think this is very telling. The fact that women are ahead in the streets is also very telling, that people in Iran are the ones who are suffering from everything. The economic pressure, people are suffering. The members of the regime never suffer from economic pressures. People are facing internet shutdowns. People are the subject of that. So Iranian people are subject of all kinds of regime's corruption, regime suppression, but the younger generation says enough is enough. We need to do something for our own future.
Yes, indeed. I 100% agree with everything you're saying. Thank you. Skylar, I want to turn to you. Thanks to the vast network of volunteers you work with on the ground, your organization has played a key role in tracking the protests, arrests, and deaths on the ground. Now that we're in day 11 of the protests, please tell us what you know. And before we do that, actually, we have a map, a heat map that I'd also like to draw attention to as well. But I'll let you start.
Yeah, thanks, Holly, and thank you to my fellow panelists as well. So yeah, before we see the map, I think it's important just to note just how widespread these protests have become. Once it's up, I'll be able to demonstrate a bit more, but in the form of numbers, seeing our protests that are spanning 93 cities at least. They're in 30 of 31 provinces. They're in 18 universities. This is really remarkable. And as you can see on this map, these heated spots, these are places where people are returning to the streets day after day. And it's, I'll just point out that this map is of yesterday, of around noon, so we're not even seeing this as of right now. These protests, they're also spanning geographic location, which is really remarkable. We're not only seeing these protests in the urban streets of Tehran, but we're seeing them in the border areas as well. They're spanning class, they're spanning age, they're spanning gender. This is something that's very unique. Unfortunately, as we've heard thus far, government totals are telling us that the deaths are reaching 41 protesters killed and 6 security forces. And as I'm sure everyone here is aware, that number is likely much, much higher and will continue to climb. The youngest reported death that we have noted is a 16-year-old boy. It's truly horrific, the things that we're seeing. Of those injured, we have reports of a 10-year-old girl shot in the head. We've verified this report. Gratefully, she has survived, but she sustained critical injuries. Hundreds of others have been injured, and we have estimates of around 3,000 arrests. These numbers are extremely high, and they will continue to rise. I think it's also important to note that of that really high number of arrests, it's predominantly these brave women that are coming to the streets. As Yegi mentioned, it's really quite inspirational to see how brave these young women are, but it's also really tragic the way that these security forces are cracking down on them as well. While these protests, as Holly mentioned, are really important, and as we talked about before, this has really been a boiling point. So we've noted a surge in repression over the past 6 months to a year that has led to note that things like the a rise in execution, a rise in arrests, a rise in things like a persecution against religious minorities, like I'm sure my colleague will note, have sparked. So just to note those numbers a bit, in 2021, we noted the number of executions at just under 300. And that was up from 238, I believe, in 2020. Just now, in September 15, 2022, that number is already at 419 for the year, well exceeding the previous year. And I think it's noteworthy that about 169 of those are for drug-related offenses. And this is despite this 2017 drug reform law. We've seen a return of these eye-for-eye punishments. So that's amputating the hand for things like theft, 3 of them in the past 6 months. A return of sentencing the blinding. We've seen a return of public executions, as Holly mentioned, 4 child offenders executed in the past year. All of these things have really led to this point where Iranians are demanding change. We hear it in the streets on these chants that Holly mentioned, and they are entitled to it. So I'll stop there and answer questions later, but I think that's an overview of where we are at the protests today.
Thank you, Skylar. Massa, thank you for joining us from London. You and I were just chatting before this event started, and I'd like you to discuss a bit about the state of the internet during these mass protests and what's the latest. I know it's very dire on the ground, so I'll hand it over to you. We're not getting sound.
Sorry, I promise I didn't mute myself. Yeah, thanks for having me and for being part of this distinguished panel with so many people who are actively working. And I know this is such an intense time for a lot of us who are working on Iran. So a lot of what we were seeing, we have been constantly comparing to the events of November 2019, which of course, has been a comparison point and a horrifying comparison point in terms of, the casualties that were seen during that protest movement. And of course, one of the highlights of what happened during November 2019 was a near total internet shutdown of connectivity to the international internet and international internet services. Of course, the National Information Network was working on and off during that period. But we've been seeing a very different situation in terms of the different techniques and hurdles they are placing on access. However, very shortly before we came, before I joined this event, I was seeing data, I was seeing disconnections that were far wider than we have been seeing during the past 11 days. It does seem that they have been attacking the networks much more aggressively just within the past hour or so. It is still not on the same level as what we saw in 2019. It's not even a near total shutdown, it appears. There are some folks with some privileged access here and there. Of course, some university institutions, medical institutions, very technically advanced folks or network engineers have connections. But I've been talking to different protest networks who have connections on the ground to various cities, and they've been telling me they've been really disconnected from most of their sources across Iran within the past 2 hours. So it does seem to be very aggressive. However, I'm not sure if this will be, a permanent state. It has been known to get very intense in terms of the restrictions they're placing within certain hours. So during the past 11 days, a pattern generally has been that mobile networks have been really severely throttled, if not completely shut down, between 4 p.m. to 1 a.m. Time within Iran. And this seems to be a time when protests really start to surge and people come out onto the streets. So it seems to be a little bit more strategic. and you might ask, and I know I've had this conversation with Holly, why aren't they doing, what they did in 2019? And there might be many different reasons. One of them being they don't want to impact the economy as much as they did back in 2019. However, they have been enabling new techniques and different ways to kind of tamper with the networks, especially as they've been trying to implement different parts of the user protection bill. There has been a lot of new methods of throttling and restricting access on the network. Obviously, they have now blocked Instagram and WhatsApp, and they have been attacking VPNs. And they, in a move that has been, I think, very impactful, in terms of their censorship strategy, they blocked Google Play Store. And of course, this is really important because most Iranians are accessing the internet through their mobile phones. The average Iranian might not have a laptop or a desktop, but they all have smartphones. And the majority of smartphones are Android phones. And so the Google Play Store was really a essential platform for downloading secure VPNs. Now there's going to be additional hurdles. If we come out of this period of very aggressive restrictions that we're experiencing within the past few hours. Ordinarily, you have to go, find an expert, a tech expert, to put a VPN on your jailbroken phone, for example. So the hurdles have certainly increased. But of course, as we are seeing and Skylar can probably talk to this as well, as they're doing the documentation work and evidence gathering off of videos and social media posts, there is still a very steady stream of content coming from the streets of Iran that's getting verified. And so, we have really important protest networks that are doing this work of, collecting the videos and posting them. The videos might go viral, but those videos at the same time are being used by professional media or outlets like BBC Persian, by Amnesty International. Skylar can say if HRANA is using this as well, but it's being verified and used for evidence gathering. So the internet has been playing a very major role despite the restrictions.
Thank you, Masa. I'm now going to turn to Anthony so that we can focus more on the wider trend of repression in the past few months. Anthony, I was hoping you could add some color to some of the remarks that I and Gavito made about the situation of the members of the Baha'i faith, but also explain to people that aren't familiar why the Islamic Republic is persecuting members of the community.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Holly, and it's a pleasure to be here with the other panelists today. I think one can view the situation of the Baha'is in Iran as kind of a microcosm of all of the things that can happen to any identifiable group within Iran. And by that, I mean there are various forms of persecution that occur against the Baha'i community, ranging all the way from childhood, where there's harassment in elementary school, to university, where Baha'i youth are excluded from the university system, to adult, or sometimes still while they're youths, associating together any kind of meeting or assemblage which involves the study of Baha'i writings or any kind of devotional meeting that is an expression of religious belief. And so the reason for the persecution of the Baha'is is that Baha'is believe in a messenger of God, or two messengers of God, actually, after the Prophet Muhammad. And the traditional interpretation within most branches of Islam is that there can be no prophet of God after the Prophet of Muhammad. But in the 19th century, there were not only the founders of the Baha'i faith who made that assertion, two individuals in succession, but also a significant minority of Muslim clergy, so that there were tens of thousands of Iranians in the mid-19th century who adopted the Baha'i religion. And that resulted in somewhere between 10 and 20,000 of them being killed by the government or by mobs instigated by the clergy. So Now in addition to that, Baha'is have certain beliefs that are a bit different from those of Islam or most traditional Islamic beliefs. For example, we believe that men and women should have equal rights and opportunities. We believe that extremes of economic inequality need to be eliminated. We believe in the independent investigation of truth, that each individual should be charged to investigating the truth on his or her own. We do not have a clergy as a result of that. No one is there to interpret the Baha'i writings for you or to investigate truth on your behalf. You can be assisted, of course, but there's no one who is in charge of telling you what to believe or how to interpret things. So, I mean, those are some very basic beliefs. There are many others that are different. So it's both a religion arising after Islam and certain beliefs that are very different from those that are currently held by the majority of clergy in Iran. Now, as to the type of persecution that has occurred, after the 1979 revolution, there were over 200 Baha'is who were executed. Most of them were members of elected Baha'i administrative institutions. Since that time, the Iranian government has systematized its persecution. That systemization is outlined in a 1991 memorandum signed by the Supreme Leader, in which he indicated that Baha'is should be excluded from university, that their economic progress should be blocked, that their social development should be blocked, and that their ability to have any kind of influence in society should be strictly limited. And so all of the policies of the government since that time have towards the Baha'is have reflected that 1991 memorandum. Now, recently, beginning in June, there's been a surge of persecution, and you outlined some of it. And rather than go through all of the details of that, I could say that simply since the beginning of June, there have been over 170 incidents of either arrests, arraignments, judicial sentencings, or raids on homes, confiscations of property. That has all occurred since the beginning of June up until a few days ago. In addition, there have been 123 Baha'i youth who have been notified that they will be excluded, despite qualifying for university. They will be excluded from university attendance at university. So this is a policy that remains very much in place. Now, we, of course, were very concerned about the implications of certain things that have occurred over the last several months, or actually over the last 2 years, that are quite systemic in nature. There were 2 appellate judicial decisions that legitimized the seizure of Baha'i property. There has been the passage of amendments to Articles 499 and 500 of the Criminal Code, which in effect make it a crime to support any unrecognized religious minority in Iran in any way. This is much more serious than the prior legislation that was in existence. There's been an increase in hate propaganda. During a 6-month period that ended in April of 2021, there was an average of 950 postings per month on social media or on the internet. This was a 36% increase over the same period in the prior year. And when you compare it to 2010 and 2011, where the number of postings was only about 22 per month, I mean, that's bad enough to have one a day. But when you see the trend upward to 950 per month, that's really preparation to try to legitimize in the eyes of the population an increase in persecution against the Baha'i community. And of course, since the last elections, there is a perception on the part of most people that all of the instruments of government, all of the organs of government are now very much solidly under the control of people who are much more, for lack of a better word, hardline in their view towards anything that deviates at all from the standard message of the regime. So we're very concerned about those developments and in fact have begun to look at atrocity prevention within the UN framework of atrocity prevention and some of the indicators that could be very much in play with respect to the situation of the Baha'i community.
Thank you so much. I wanted to actually ask you a follow-up question that I think would be also adding color to the situation of the plight of Baha'is is, why does the Islamic Republic falsely label them as quote-unquote Zionist spies? I think that would be helpful to explain for people that are watching. Oh, certainly.
Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah is a title, by the way. It means the glory of God. The name with which he was born with was Hussein Ali Nuri. And he was exiled from Iran in 1853 to first to Baghdad and then to other parts of the Ottoman Empire, the last of which was at that time a prison city in what at that time was Palestine of the Ottoman Empire, to the prison city of Akka. He arrived there in 1868, and since his arrival there, the Baha'i World Center, beginning very modestly with his prison cell, has been located in what is today Israel, and of course was established roughly 40 years before the establishment of the State of Israel. But the fact that the Baha'i community that the Baha'i World Center has existed there and has been permitted by the authorities, first the British and then the Israelis, to function, has been used as an excuse by the Iranian government to label the Baha'is as spies of Israel. That would be similar to labeling anyone who went to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem as being a spy of Israel, because that's under Israeli control. But it's a convenient excuse of the Iranian government.
Well, thank you so much for your explanation. I had the honor of visiting Haifa and going up there, so thank you. Mm-hmm. Yagi, I'm going to turn back to you. As part of your work at CPJ, you actually follow the plight of journalists in Iran. And of course, as I've said in remarks, we've had at least 20 that have been arrested so far. I was hoping you could maybe explain what has the situation been like for journalists in the past year in Iran.
Sure. I want to start by opening a small correction parenthesis and say the number of journalists arrested during the past few days during the protest since the unfortunate death of Mahsa Amini is now 23rd. And right before coming to this event, we documented 24th arrest, but we were not able to update the website yet. And it's very telling to say that from those 23 journalists that we have documented so far, more than half of them are women. And only the 3 arrests today were all women. So all of this is very telling. And this trend is not very new in the sense that Iran is always and regularly one of the most censored countries in the world. It often lands on CPJ's most censored and most jailer of the journalists. So in 2021, we documented 11 journalists behind bars, and unfortunately this year, as you can see, it's going beyond control. But the regime has always tried to silence any critical voice, and journalists happen to be the first victim because they have the podium and they have the voice, and the society listens to them, and not just the inside community, but also the international community has always been very eager to listen to Iranian journalists. That's one of the fault of the regime itself, because as they censor more, people are eager more and more. As you know the trend, they don't let many foreign journalists usually travel to Iran, so that's why the international community has to look into Iranian journalists and look for information and the news from inside Iran. And the situation has been bad, particularly since 2017, when the sporadic protests started, and then it got terribly worse for journalists in 2019 with many, many arrests and internet shutdown. The truth is that the numbers we are publishing at the Committee to Protect Journalists are not the correct tally of the journalists behind bars, because as all of us referred to so far, including Mahsa and you, Holly, in a situation that the country is completely shut down and Iran is a black hole, that getting any information from inside the country is almost impossible. We really don't know how many journalists have been arrested. Many of the arrests, interestingly, did not happen this time around only in Tehran. They happened in Kurdish provinces. They happened in Kerman province. They also happened in the northern cities of Iran. In 2019, if you remember, when the internet was seriously near total shutdown, Mohammad Mosaed, who is here today with us, an Iranian journalist, was very outspoken at the time and was reporting for Sharq Daily, used all kinds of proxies. According to his own tweet, I think he said 43 something proxies to be able to just send one quick tweet and let the world know that the regime has succeeded in a sense that they have silenced all critical voices. They are controlling. I think this time around, their efforts are not being successful in a sense that we all have seen those videos. They cannot hide the reality on the ground by shutting down internet or jailing journalists anymore. That's the truth. But arrest, detaining them in horrible situation, violent situation, multiples of these cases that we have documented in the past couple of days at CPJ, the arrests were very violent. They always somehow follow this pattern of security forces raiding journalists' home after midnight, scaring the neighbors, scaring all bystanders. Families, they have young children, take them to undisclosed locations for many, many days before their families can locate them, that they are, for example, in Qarchak prison or they are in Evin prison. Days go by and they sit in solitary confinement without any trial, without any due process, without being able to access any lawyer, as I'm sure Mohammed can attest to all of this because he went through a similar fate and was eventually sentenced to 4.5 years in prison before being able to leave the country by foot. So none of these trends are new, but it's mind-blowing, to be honest, that unfortunately the international community is watching, but there's not enough reaction. We at CPJ every day renew our demand and call on Iran's regime, Islamic Republic, to free all of these journalists immediately and unconditionally, and because it's been proven that all of these arrests are arbitrary arrests and there is no fact behind these arrests. They are free of any wrongdoing, any crime. They haven't done anything wrong. These journalists are just doing their truthful mission of reporting the truth on the ground so the world can see what this regime is doing to people. Just today, 2 of the female journalists that were arrested in the city of Sirjan. Just think about it. How many times in the world people have heard about the word Sirjan? Probably none. And 2 very young female journalists where they're covering their hometown protests, and they were brutally arrested, taken into custody, and it took over a week for their families to be able to locate them and confirm that, yes, they are sitting in Sirjan Central Prison.
This is a very heavy event. Thank you, Yegi. I'm going to turn to you, Masa, again. Gavito mentioned in her remarks the U.S. Treasury Department issuing a general license D2 to increase support for internet freedom, something we've been pushing for, you and I and many others, for years, me more recently. So I'd like you to explain how this general license will help the Iranian question. And I think the million-dollar question for many of us is, what role does Starlink play in this? And I'm sorry to put that question to you, but it's going to be asked no matter what.
I'm glad Elon is here to, lighten our moods a little bit. I guess I'll start with Starlink. So Starlink being available in Iran used to have a long list of hurdles. And I guess at the top of that list were sanctions. And so with the passing of GLD2 by the US Treasury, it's a really great move. Obviously, it's a belated move. This should have happened in 2013 when the original general license was given for personal communication. So it's definitely late, but of course, better late than never. But, harm has been done, I think, in that period that it should have been, passed sooner. And I can delve into that. But approaching Starlink, there are a lot of hurdles, and there has been a lot of disinformation. There has even been malware related to Starlink. So, this like viral hope that Iranians have that Starlink is going to come and save the day has actually resulted in some harmful things. So, there was a malware link being passed around to say that this would be one of the connections for Iranians. There has been false photos that if you do a Google reverse search on that claims like, here's a Starlink device in Iran, and if you do a search on it, you see that photo is actually from 2-3 years ago. So there's been a lot of disinformation. I'm sure, Holly, you know this better than me. You're one of the experts on these areas as well. I have yet to see an example of Starlink working in Iran. And I really, what I fear, and of course, I hope Starlink can work. It would be great. There are hurdles, one being how do you get the devices in? Second being if connections are detected, what kind of brutal repression is going to ensue when the authorities can detect the satellite connections? Another is the technology for laser beaming Starlink technology actually fully functional with Starlink? And of course, previously in all other locations Starlink has worked, they have had licenses and cooperation with the states. Iran is the first state they want to work in where they don't have cooperation with them. So they had ground infrastructure to enable those connections. About a year ago, they announced that they had this new laser beam technology that meant that they didn't need ground connections. However, it hasn't been clarified transparently if that technology is fully enabled right now in 2022 where we are. And I really hope to see evidence that Starlink is working and is being useful. But until then, I think Starlink is a distraction from the very real and useful things that we could be doing for other technologies. Are we spending enough time on getting the right VPNs to Iranians, ones that are actually useful to work on mobile phones? There's a lot of VPNs being offered that just work on desktops and laptops that haven't been, fully functionalized to the realities of internet use in Iran. Are we paying attention to how, the platforms that are being used by Iranians like Instagram and Twitter are working within this context to, enable the best kind of access, enable, proxy servers or light versions of their application. So I feel like there's a whole bunch of other things we could be doing in the technology field that might be getting a little bit distracted by Starlink without actually knowing if it's working or not. In terms of what the sanctions have enabled, of course, there were a host of different companies that were not providing their services to Iran. Google was the biggest perpetrator if we look at the different services that weren't allowed. So Google cloud computing services were not allowed to be used in Iran. And Google Cloud and AWS are the biggest companies in terms of internet infrastructure, in terms of helping developers host their servers, host their websites. And the fact that we had technologists, we had startups and companies not be able to use these services meant that they had to turn to national alternatives. And so during this period when there were sanctions on these services, we saw a lot of local alternatives thrive and grow. And these local alternatives, one company that has been really well known is Abra Arvan, and these companies were actively cooperating and helping authorities build infrastructure for nationalization that has been very detrimental, obviously, to, the possibility of internet shutdowns working. Because whenever internet shutdowns obviously occur, if there are non-familiar folks, the National Information Network is supposed to be the default network that works and enables the country to function. So considerable amount of damage has been done already, but that doesn't mean that this isn't good news. And the way forward, obviously, is working with the companies to ensure that they are complying with this license and ensuring that the services are working. There is still a hurdle in place to things like Google Cloud Services or using AWS and these other services, which is, of course, these are paid services. So the folks that can actually use these will be, very privileged types of users or technologists who have connections to outside Iran that can use financial services or foreign credit cards. So I think really the onus is not only to make sure that these companies are providing their services undeterred now, but are taking extra steps. I think one of the asks that we're developing at Article 19 is to actually turn to Google and ask them to provide free services to their Iranian users who do not have foreign credit cards to be able to sign up for their services to ensure that this support system exists despite these challenges.
Thank you so much for your explanation, Masa. Skylar, as we noted last week, the U.S. government took steps to designate some of those responsible for human rights abuses. This is a question I'm asking you, but I'm also going to put to the rest as well. For you, I asked, what other tools can you recommend to ensure these perpetrators are held accountable? And then for the rest of you, I'll go one by one and ask for policy recommendations. But Skylar, I start with you.
Thanks, Holly. I guess I get the brunt of the how do we fix the issue. I think, not to skip over the sanctions, because the targeted sanctions that the U.S. imposed are really important. They're proven tools, they're strong tools, and they're separate from the broad sectoral sanctions that cause the collective punishment. And so what we can do, though, is we can broaden the tools and we can coordinate them. So what do I mean by that? Yesterday, as you might have heard, Canada, they also remarked on pushing out dozens of these designations as well. We don't know who or as I sat on the stage, we don't know who they're going to designate yet, but we haven't heard anything from the EU. They held an emergency meeting this morning, so we assume that they're also going to push out some designations. Silence from the UK and Australia, two places that also have this ability, and two places, frankly, that have personal connections to the brutality that the regime, puts out. So I think that we really should be pushing for a coordinated approach to this type of accountability. You can imagine the pressure that could be felt if we're hearing that these designations are coming from this united front of states. Aside from that, I think we really need to be focusing on what can happen at the United Nations right now, both in Geneva and in New York. In Geneva, right now, it's the Human Rights Council. Yesterday, at the general debate, we heard from 17 all Western states. They all very vaguely called on Iran to conduct independent and partial investigations, very hollow calls. You can't have an independent, impartial investigation in a country that doesn't have an independent and impartial judiciary. Yeah. These are calls that happen all of the time, and really time to put an end to that. At the Human Rights Council, these same states can call for a UN-led mechanism to conduct independent and impartial investigations, not only about what's happening now, but about other things happening in Iran. And I really think that this is the opportunity to do that. In New York, right now, Canada is the penholder for the Iran resolution in the Third Committee at the General Assembly. There is no reason that language on accountability, concrete steps towards accountability, not these hollow calls, should be in this resolution. And I also think that there's space to include language on the brutality that we're seeing right now in that resolution as well.
Thank you. Before I continue, I just wanted to say if you have questions, please enter them in the iPad that are around the room. Thank you. Anthony, I know you mentioned UN framework earlier. I was hoping you could maybe elaborate on that and other opportunities that could be to
Sure. As I'm sure most people in the audience probably know, that there are 3 UN special rapporteurs that are relevant to the situation in Iran. The Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran, the Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion and belief, and also the Special Rapporteur on minority issues. And there's probably either a rapporteur or another type of figure within the UN system that would be relevant for other aspects of the situation in Iran. So certainly a much more vigorous push in that area to try to influence positively the developments that occur over the coming years would be very much welcomed. But in addition, I think that it's very important for leaders to speak out. They do, but they don't do it with the kind of frequency and volume that would be needed to address a situation like this. And it's not done in as coordinated a fashion as one would hope. Certainly, there is oftentimes a sense that the Iranian government pays no attention to what occurs outside of Iran. But the Baha'i community is certainly convinced that the reason why the Iranian government stopped executing 20 to 30 Baha'is per year, they were doing that from roughly 1980 till 1986. The reason why they stopped doing that was because of international pressure and the fact that it was becoming a source of shame, of international embarrassment. And we certainly know that today, in particular, the average citizen in Iran, we're quite certain from surveys that have taken place over the last several years from different organizations, do not have the hostility towards either the Baha'is or other groups within Iran that the government would like to think that they have.
Thank you. Yegi, over to you. What would you like to see done? I know as someone that lives in Iran, this is a very personal matter for you, as someone of Iranian heritage, but also on your, as someone that works at CPJ, I think I'd like to ask both versions of what you would like to see done.
Right. As someone who works at CPJ, I think the freedom of information and the freedom of expression is obviously the most important topic that we care about. People access to information inside the country and their access to, let's say, social media to be able to be heard outside the country is my first and foremost concern, and my colleagues. So, and I think personally, in order to be able to help people right now on the ground, is to help them to be heard and seen, because the government's main intention by shutting down all doors on people is to be able to suffocate them as much as possible. And if it is not for those brave Iranians who are right now carrying the torch of citizen journalism, we know that traditional journalists are probably either scared off, or let's be honest, in a country that all media is state-run media, of course a journalist right now cannot write an article about whatever that is happening in the street tomorrow morning in Sharq News Daily or in IRIB, in Islamic Republic's TV or radio. Therefore, I think it's very important. I'm not a policymaker, but my asks to U.S. government and the international community is, as Mahsa said, to make sure that at least technical grounds are available for Iranians to be able to communicate to the outside world. Otherwise, we will never know the correct number of Iranians who have been killed, arrested, thrown in jail, or abused in any other way. So if it is Google, if it is Facebook, if it is Twitter, if it is any other technical or IT company that is able and willing to provide free access to Iranians. I talk to friends that say they do not have any credit card, for example, to be able to sign up. As a result of the new law, the new internet ban bill that they passed in Iran's parliament a few months ago, we saw a surge among Iranians just reporting on social media that they cannot log in back to their account if they are, however, logged out of their account on WhatsApp because they were not able to receive the messaging code on their Iranian phone numbers. So these are, I would like to think, are small steps that IT companies are able to, or big companies are able to facilitate for Iranian users on the ground. However, as I said, I'm not a policymaker. I don't know if some of these hurdles are removed, if the regime is able to take advantage of it or not. So that's my ask. I just want my people to be heard, to be seen, because they deserve to be heard and they deserve to be seen despite everything they are going through.
Thank you. Mahsa, I know you mentioned some asks earlier, but I just wanted to give you the space to add any further recommendations.
I absolutely agree with everything Yagana said. I don't know if I have more to add to that because she's really hit home on the importance of communication, awareness. I mean, the importance of social media right now, for protesters themselves to be seen, to see each other is incredibly powerful. And, I hope this momentum is kept up. And I really hope that this moment is actually going to have an impact on these tech companies to actually prioritize just very even simple asks, like what Yegi was saying in terms of WhatsApp and two-factor authorization. That's a bit more complicated, and we should definitely lobby and spend time. But even more simple things like Twitter should just create a hash flag for the Mahsa Amini hashtag that, I think it's achieved a historical moment on Twitter. Last I checked, there was over 90 million tweets on Mahsa Amini in Persian, and just these simple things that companies can be doing to help folks be seen is, I think, incredibly important. But also, the more complicated technical aspects need to be paying attention, and they should be working with experts in civil society to take advantage of this moment and momentum and really center these vulnerable users who are in need.
Yeah. Thank you, Mahsa. I'm going to go to questions from the audience now. This one's for you, Skylar. I think you're the best person to answer this. There are many talks about workers in industry strikes in Iran. How widespread and serious are these strikes?
Thanks, Holly. So yes, this is definitely something that we've been tracking, especially in the past 6 months to a year. I think most notably what I can speak to are the teachers' unions strikes as well, or not strikes, excuse me, but even these peaceful protests. I think, coming back to the discussion we're having today about the protests and the suppression of protests and the widespread arrests we're seeing, in the past 6 months, we've noted the arrest of 150 teachers' unions, peaceful protesting. These members, I think this is, indicative of a policy of suppressing protests. There's no space for people to be heard. There's no space for peaceful assembly, and this is really indicative of that. Of course, it's wider than the teachers' unions. We see labor unions, and that comes directly back to the economic problems that we see across the country. But yeah, it's certainly a trend, and it's certainly widespread across the country.
Thank you so much. Massa, I have a question for you. I mean, of course, it's on your favorite subject, Starlink. Has any reliable source ever claimed that optical communications between Starlink satellites have been activated? And are there any reliable sources on this? I haven't really seen that, but I'm wondering if you have.
So I feel like a total imposter for even pretending like I have technical expertise about what Starlink is and what it does. So I'm really not the person. So I think there are far more qualified people to talk to. But I think what this question is getting at is the same thing I mentioned, which is that technology that makes it possible to function within a country that doesn't have the ground infrastructure that Starlink ordinarily has. And the only source that I found was an article that had statements from Starlink spokespeople from May 2021 talking about how they were really launching new satellites that could do this. So there has been no official update that I have found. So if there can be, I do know I have been speaking with journalists who are investigating this, and I'm very hopeful their investigations will shed more clarity on this in the coming days and weeks. So I guess stay tuned.
I hope so too. I really would like some journalists to dig deep on this subject because it's been something that I think a lot of Iranians would like to know the answers to, and we haven't had enough of. Anthony, I have a question for you as well. Have there been particular developments over the last year or two that have you more worried than usual about the future of the Baha'i community in Iran?
Yes, there are. I mentioned a few. One was the hate propaganda, and also the change in the Penal Code of Iran, the amendments to Articles 499 and 500 that essentially criminalize any activity on behalf of an unrecognized religious minority. We've also noticed statistically that there's been quite a change in the way the Iranian government utilizes its criminal justice system. There are now over 1,000 Baha'is who are in the criminal justice system, somewhere from arrest to, an initial hearing, to getting out on bail, to having a sentence provided, to appeal, and then final sentencing. This whole process can take anywhere from 6 months to 8 years, and it's usually on the longer side. At the worst point of persecution during the administration of Ahmadinejad, there were only 443 Baha'is in the criminal justice system at the height, but now there are over 1,000. And that suggests to us not only is the government interested in punishing Baha'is, but also in just simply intimidating them, so that when you're out on bail, you can't plan your life because you don't know what's going to happen next. And I see Yege nodding here, and it sounds as though
it's a very similar trend to what journalists are going through. Recently, they started adding, sorry for interrupting, they started adding one new charge to many, many charges. And then as a result of that, they now sentence journalists after they get released to, for example, 2 years ban from journalism activities. And I have had people call us at CPJ saying, I now paint buildings, but I was trained to be a journalist. And he was saying that with honor, not that there is anything wrong with painting buildings, but the fact that this person could not go and get a job in a serious company or have any social professional position. So they are now banning journalists from practicing journalism, but the trend is very similar. At CPJ, we call it a revolving door. They keep journalists at this revolving door, and they keep this heavy sentence over their head like a hammer, and they can bang it on them every time they wish, and summon them and take them for several months of solitary confinement, and then release them again on bail, heavy bails that families are barely able to post.
There's one variant on that is internal exile after serving your sentence. You know, you get sentenced to 3 years, you serve your 3 years, but then you've got to spend 2 years in some remote village where you have no idea how you're going to make a living or anything like that, and away from your family.
I didn't think they would do that to Baha'is, because it's not because of their professions, right?
No,
I always
that's right.
associated that sentencing to journalists. I thought maybe if they send a journalist from Tehran to Abadan, he cannot be a journalist there or cannot find a job, but it's heartbreaking.
Yeah. So this is another aspect of simply grinding, you know, a community or people in a particular profession into submission.
Thank you. This is a question, I guess, that Skylar probably could be best to answer, but if not, I understand, because you're not an international law lawyer, if I'm not mistaken. Is it possible to prosecute Iranian officials when traveling on diplomatic terms? I'm thinking they might be asking because of Raisi's visit to the U.S. last week, but.
So first I'll start with, I am qualified to answer the question. And second, I think I'll start with the Raisi visit, because though it was quite emotional, I think, for many people to see Raisi here, he was here because the United Nations the U.S. has a United Nations headquarters agreement, so they are required to host foreign diplomats under that rule. It's quite infuriating, I think, for some to see, for most to see, but it's under that pretext that he was here, not for some, I think, other reason. And I think that this is why we want to focus so much on targeted sanctions and the aspect of universal jurisdiction, which I know sometimes seems like they work against each other, right? Because if you're sanctioned, you're not going to want to travel to a country. But this year we saw the first case of universal jurisdiction in Sweden against an Iranian, and so this is really the answer to that question. If an Iranian perpetrator is traveling to a country, and say we use the Swedish example, and he has committed crimes that are up to the level that is they've put into their, that they've codified into their laws, they can be prosecuted under Swedish jurisdiction for those crimes under the principle of universal jurisdiction. And this really fills the gap, because when there's no domestic judicial procedure available, like the case in Iran currently, we have that available in this case. So I guess that's the simplest answer to the question for a very long explanation.
Thank you for answering that, and I do apologize. It's been a heavy 2 weeks, and I think for anybody working on Iran, you're mixing a lot of things up these days, and myself included, so I do apologize.
That's okay.
I think we have all the questions answered that are related to this panel. I want to thank you all so much for being here. It's been a tough couple of weeks, and of course, the rise and repression of Iran has made our work a lot more busier. And we're just absolutely honored to have you all here. And thank you all for watching and attending. And we hope that you'll be tuning into our future events at the Atlantic Council. Thank you.